3 through 7. Ephesians 5, verses 3 through 7, and it says this: "But among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, false talk, or foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a man as an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things God's wrath comes upon those who are disobedient. Therefore do not be partners with them." Now we're looking at this scripture. We've already talked about part of it, but to keep the context, I want to read that chunk of it there. We last Sunday spent some time together talking about some of these issues that Paul's dealing with. In verse 3, the sexual immorality, the impurity, the greed, the things that are improper for God's holy people. And so we spent last week really talking about, spent a lot of time talking about sexual immorality and what does that look like, and God's view of sex and dating and all of those things that we talked about. And I missed something last week. When I got done, I got home and was preparing myself for my afternoon nap. I love Sunday afternoon naps. They are valuable. But I was just thinking and just kind of recapping the day in my mind a little bit. And this thought came to my mind, and I want to go back and put this in here to bring it into the culture, the context of us today. I talked about the fact that sex is for marriage, within the bonds of marriage and marriage alone. And I missed this statement, and so I put it in last week's message notes, so if I ever preach that again, it's going to be there, but I give it to you this morning. Let me just make this statement: friends with benefits. We hear that in our culture today. Church, that's wrong, and I want to put that in there and help you understand that. Friends with benefits is not scriptural. And I just put that in there because it just fit the message very, very well. It's not a scriptural practice. It's wrong. That marriage covenant brings the sexual act into the right view and the right perspective. But outside of that, church, it's wrong and it's sin. And so understand that. Friends with benefits, as much as we hear that, and our culture wants to make it okay, church, it's not. And so there you go. That's free. That's the end of last week's sermon. We continue today with verse number 4. Talked about those things in verse 3 last week. Verse 4, we continue on. "Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving." Now, what's Paul do here again? Now, we've covered this pretty extensively when we talked about it, and so I'm just going to highlight again. And we see Paul doing this time and time again. He talks about it here, and then a few verses later he brings it back again, and he keeps bringing it back again because he wants us to get the point. He talks about, really, the bottom line, controlling our tongue in these verses again. Obscenity, foolish talk, coarse joking. Paul addresses this issue of our tongue, of what comes out of our mouth once again. And you'll see him bring this back to chapter 4, verse 29 when we preach through that. Let's go back and read that just to refresh your memory. It said this: "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." And so we spent an entire message on that thought of what comes out of your mouth, and am I building others up with my speech and my language, and how I treat others with my tongue, or am I not? And so Paul brings this back again. He says, we can't have obscenity, the false, the coarse joking, the foolish talk, those things. Paul says again, we can't let those things come from our mouth. We have been separated from them. We've been set free from them. And so they need to not be a part of our lives anymore. So I won't take a long time on this, but I want to talk about this word obscenity just a moment this morning. What does he mean when he makes that statement? Nor should there be obscenity from your mouth. And it really ties with last week's sermon, but it goes deeper than that. This issue of obscenity, and we, again, our culture, unfortunately, our culture, our American society is very good at this, of obscenity, of coarse things that really shouldn't be a part of our lives. But But oftentimes television shows and movies and music and all of those things, that's really the theme, and that's what makes them funny, so to speak. The dirty things, the comments, the sexual innuendos, and those kinds of things. Unfortunately, our society begins to and paints those things as funny, or what makes the show. And church, again, Paul deals with it and says, hey, we can't have that. We can't let ourselves be a part of that. We have to separate ourselves from those things. So let me define for you obscenity according to the dictionary. We go back, we read it in there. The state or quality of being obscene. Well, thanks a lot. But then it goes on and gives us more information than that. Obscene behavior, language, or images. So I want to stop there and put this idea of obscenity. It's further than just the sexual side of that. And that's one of the major areas that we consider obscene, and those areas. But it goes way beyond that. It goes to our languages, our language. It goes to the images. It goes to the immorality issue that we talked about last week. Impropriety, lewdness, impurity, crudeness, vulgarity. These are all part of this issue of obscenity coming out of your mouth. Dirtiness or dirt or filth. Crudity, profanity. To be an extremely offensive word or expression. An explicitive, the swear word, the profanity, the cursing, the four-letter words, the dirty words, and the last one they put in there is blasphemy. So that's the idea that Paul brings when he says obscenity. It's not just, again, in that sexual side of our lives, but it is broadened out to every part of our life, to our minds and what we think, and the coarseness that sometimes comes from our mouth, and the swear words, the profanity, all of that. And again, what does Paul say? He says we have to put those things away. Those were the things of our old lifestyle, our BC days, before Christ's days. Those may have been a part of your life then, but when we meet Christ, church, this needs to change. And so Paul encourages us and says, put those things away, get rid of them. And again, he brings it back, church. We have to learn to control what comes out of our mouth. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I say this in marriage counseling and premarital counseling. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen twice as much as you speak. And it's great advice. If we learn to listen rather than automatically speak and then have to go back and apologize and deal with the things that we've said. Once a word's spoken, you can't ever take it back. And unfortunately, we think we can sometimes, but you can't. The hurt's done, and the hurt can be forgiven, but it's still there. And so, listen much more than you speak. We have to learn to control what comes from our mouth. And Paul brings it back to our minds again. There's no place for these kinds of talk or this kind of action coming from a Christian. Paul says what? He said to get rid of it, to make it go away. So there's no obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, but rather thanksgiving. And there's what we replace it with. And Paul does it there again. And rather than this old way of life, he says this is the new way of life. Be thankful. Learn how to be thankful. And we talked about that several weeks ago as we walked through Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. Speaking life into people rather than death and hurt and pain into their lives. And church, I want you to understand we've been freed from this. And as Macy and the team were leading us, she began to pray and made that statement that the freedom from sin, church, Christ has set us free. We don't have to live in the bondage of that sin any longer. Church, the freedom in Christ has been given, and we can be victorious in these areas of our lives. Is it easy? No. Sometimes we have developed these patterns of coarse joking and of foolish talk and the things that Paul talks about. And we've lived that way for a long time. And there are habits that are within us that need to be broken. And church, sometimes they're difficult things to handle. And guess what? You can't handle it alone. Where do we go back to? Christ in us. The first 3 chapters. This is Christ in us. And because of the holiness and righteousness of Christ in me, I can have victory in these areas of my life. So that idea of putting those things away, replacing them with thanksgiving, is your mouth speaking life, thanksgiving, or is it not? And of course, you have to answer that question for yourself. Then Paul gives us the result of allowing these things into our lives, these sins that he's talked about here, and of course this is really this entire chapter, the chapter before and this chapter that comes together as Paul begins to kind of bring a conclusion to this thought of this Christian living in this part of our life, the do and the don't list. And Paul lays out for us this thought of the results of not dealing with these. It's not a pretty picture. Paul says, okay, here's the deal. Get rid of all these things. Don't have these things in your life. Let them go. And then he says, if you don't, this is what's going to happen. Let's go back and read verse 5. Where is verse 5 beginning? There we go. He talks about, of course, joking those things, and then he says this, for this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a man is an idolater. The things he's just talked about, he brings back again and says, anyone that is doing these things, no one that is doing these things, number one, you become an idolater, and if you do that, you have no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God.